I married a man I did not love on a night when the fog swallowed London whole, and I told myself it was the only way to survive. But survival, I would learn, has a price that cannot be calculated in pounds or promises, and mine came due the moment the wedding scanner illuminated a ghost I had buried in the deepest chamber of my heart. My name is Eleanor Ashford, and I was 23 years old when I became the wife of Cornelius Vane. I remember the weight of the ivory silk against my skin, the way the gaslight caught the seed pearls sewn into my bodice, the faint tremor in my gloved hands as I signed my name in the registry, Mrs. Cornelius Vane. The ink gleamed wet and black, and I thought of how easily a single signature could erase a woman, could transform her from one thing into another, could close a door that would never open again. The nib of the pen scratched against the paper like a creature trying to escape, and I felt something inside me trying to escape too, something I had locked away so tightly that I had almost forgotten it existed. The scratch of that pen was the sound of my old life ending and my new one beginning, though I did not yet understand what that new life would truly cost me. The ceremony had been held in the private chapel of Vane Manor, a cold stone room with stained glass windows that depicted not saints or angels, but geometric patterns, spirals and hexagons, and the strange crystalline structures that Cornelius claimed to see when he looked at the world. The light that filtered through those windows was not the warm gold of church glass, but something cooler, something that reminded me of the blue glow of refined ether, the substance that had made my husband one of the richest men in England. There were no flowers at our wedding. Cornelius did not believe in them. He said they were inefficient, beautiful for a day, and dead the next. A waste of resources that could be better spent on things that lasted. I had nodded when he said this, had smiled and agreed, but in my heart I had mourned the roses I would never carry, the orange blossoms I would never wear in my hair, the sweet perfume that would never fill the air as I spoke my vows. The chapel was cold despite the fires burning in the grates at either end. I could see my breath misting in the air as I spoke the words that would bind me to this man forever, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. Each promise felt like a stone being placed upon my chest, each vow a link in a chain I was forging around my own wrists. But I spoke them anyway, because the alternative was a life of poverty and shame, a slow fade into invisibility, a death by 1,000 small humiliations. He was a man of science, my husband, a man of progress, a man who believed that everything, even love, even loyalty, even the soul itself, could be measured and quantified and controlled. I had known this when I agreed to marry him. I had known it, and I had accepted it, because I had watched my mother die worn down by grief and want after my father's disgrace, and I had sworn that I would not follow her into that particular grave. My mother had been beautiful once, full of life and laughter and a fierce intelligence that she had been forced to hide because society did not value clever women. She had loved my father with a devotion that had sustained her through the good years and destroyed her in the bad ones. When he died, she simply stopped living, fading away over the course of 6 terrible months until there was nothing left of her but bones and skin and eyes that stared at nothing. I would not let that happen to me. I would not love anyone the way my mother had loved my father. I would not give anyone that kind of power over me. And so I had said yes to Cornelius Vane. I had said yes to his cold eyes and his precise manner and his house full of machines. I had said yes, and I had told myself that it was enough to be safe, to be respectable, to have a name that would open doors instead of closing them. I had told myself that I did not need love. I had told myself that I had already had my share of love and that it had brought me nothing but heartbreak. I had almost convinced myself that this was true. The guests at our wedding were few and carefully selected, perhaps a dozen people who sat in the cold stone pews and watched us exchange our vows with expressions that ranged from curiosity to calculation. Cornelius did not believe in large gatherings any more than he believed in flowers. He said that crowds were unpredictable, that too many people in one place created variables that could not be controlled. And so our wedding was witnessed by investors and business associates, by distant relatives who had traveled from the countryside with barely concealed interest in seeing what manner of creature would willingly walk into his gilded cage. I gave them nothing to gossip about. I smiled and nodded and spoke the vows in a voice that did not tremble, and when the minister pronounced us man and wife, I allowed Cornelius to press his lips briefly against mine. His kiss was dry and cool, like the touch of paper, and I felt nothing at all. This, I told myself, was a good thing. Feeling nothing was better than feeling too much. Feeling nothing was safe. After the ceremony, there was a small reception in the manor's great hall, a cavernous space with soaring ceilings and walls lined with paintings of Cornelius's ancestors. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across the polished floor. Servants in black and white moved silently among the guests, offering champagne and tiny sandwiches and sweets arranged on silver trays. I accepted a glass of champagne and held it without drinking, watching the bubbles rise to the surface like tiny prayers escaping toward heaven. I wondered what my father would have thought if he could see me now, dressed in silk and pearls, the wife of the man who had once been his rival. Would he have been proud of my survival or ashamed of the price I had paid for it? Would he have understood that sometimes survival requires compromise, requires sacrifice, requires the willingness to become something other than what you had hoped to be? I would never know. My father was dead, buried in a grave I had not been able to afford to mark properly, and whatever wisdom he might have offered me was lost forever. I had met Cornelius 8 months before at a charity ball hosted by Lady Ashworth in her magnificent townhouse on Park Lane. I was there as a guest of my Aunt Constance, the only relative who still acknowledged me after my father's disgrace. Aunt Constance was my mother's sister, a widow with a comfortable income and a sharp tongue, and she had taken me in after my mother's death more out of duty than affection. She made sure I knew in 100 small ways that I was a burden she was carrying out of family obligation, that my presence in her home was a constant reminder of the scandal that had touched our family. I wore a borrowed gown that evening, one of Aunt Constance's older dresses that she had reluctantly altered to fit me. The fabric was a faded blue that had once been lovely but now looked tired and sad, like a flower pressed between the pages of a book. I had done my best to make it presentable, had sewn new ribbon along the hem and added a bit of lace at the neckline, but I knew that anyone with a discerning eye would see me for what I was, a woman clinging to the wreckage of a life that had sunk beneath the waves. Lady Ashworth's ballroom was magnificent, a vast space with gilded walls and a ceiling painted with scenes of classical mythology. The music was provided by an orchestra seated on a raised platform at one end of the room, and the dancers moved across the polished floor in perfect synchronization, their movements as precise and predictable as the gears of a clock. I did not dance. I had not danced since the night my father died, and I had no intention of ever dancing again. Dancing required joy, and joy was something I could no longer afford. I remember standing near the windows, watching the couples spin and dip and glide, feeling that peculiar loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who do not see you. I was invisible in that room, a ghost haunting the edges of a party I had not been invited to join. The laughter and music washed over me like waves over a stone, wearing me down with every passing moment. And then he appeared at my elbow, a glass of champagne in each hand, and said, without preamble, "You are the daughter of Frederick Ashford." It was not a question. Cornelius Vane never asked questions when he already knew the answers. He was tall and lean, with silver threaded through his dark hair, though he could not have been more than 40, and his eyes were the color of winter ice, pale blue and utterly clear. He wore his wealth quietly, in the cut of his coat and the quality of his cufflinks. But there was nothing quiet about the way he looked at me. It was the gaze of a man who had spent his life acquiring things and who had just identified something new he wished to possess. I should have been offended, I should have made some excuse and walked away. No respectable woman would have allowed herself to be approached so boldly by a man to whom she had not been properly introduced. But I was tired, so tired of being invisible, of being pitied, of being the daughter of a dead man whose name could not be spoken in polite company without a shudder of distaste. And so I took the champagne he offered, and I let him lead me to a quiet corner, and I listened as he told me what he wanted. He wanted a wife. Not for love, he was quite clear about that, but for practicality. He was building an empire, he said, and empires required foundations. A wife of good family, even a family fallen into disgrace, was better than no wife at all. And I, he said, had something else that interested him. I had my father's eyes, the eyes of an inventor, the eyes of someone who looked at the world and saw not what was, but what could be. I remember the way my heart had stuttered when he said that. My father's eyes. It had been so long since anyone had mentioned my father without contempt, without pity, without that particular tone of voice that suggested he had deserved his fate. To hear Cornelius speak of him with something approaching respect, even admiration, was like water to a woman dying of thirst. I did not tell him that I had inherited more than my father's eyes. I did not tell him about the notebooks hidden in the false bottom of my trunk, the diagrams and equations that I had memorized before the creditors came to take everything else. I did not tell him that I understood, better than anyone alive, the work my father had been doing before he died. I simply smiled and sipped my champagne and asked him what he was offering in return. Security, he said, respectability, a home, a name that would open doors instead of closing them, and freedom of a sort. He would not expect me to love him. He would not even expect me to share his bed unless I wished it. He wanted a partner, he said, a companion, someone who could stand beside him at social functions and manage his household and bear his name without bringing him shame. It was not a romantic proposal. It was barely a proposal at all. It was a business arrangement, a contract, a transaction between two people who each had something the other needed. And I, who had spent the last 2 years watching my life crumble around me, who had sold my mother's jewelry and my father's books and finally my own pride just to keep a roof over my head, I said yes. I said yes, and I told myself it was the sensible thing to do. I said yes, and I told myself that love was a luxury I could not afford. I said yes, and I buried the memory of another man so deep that I almost convinced myself he had never existed at all. Almost. The wedding night began with a ritual I had not anticipated. After the last guest had departed and the servants had cleared away the remnants of the reception, Cornelius led me not to the bridal chamber, but to a room I had never seen before. We walked through corridor after corridor, past doors of polished mahogany and walls hung with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, until we reached a part of the house that felt different from the rest. The air was cooler here, and there was a faint hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once, a vibration I could feel in my bones. The corridors in this wing were lined not with paintings, but with copper mesh, panels of intricate metalwork that gleamed in the gaslight like captured lightning. Strange devices were mounted on the walls at regular intervals, glass bulbs filled with swirling blue luminescence that pulsed in slow, rhythmic patterns. It was beautiful and unsettling, like walking through the veins of some vast mechanical creature. Cornelius stopped before a door that looked no different from any other and pressed his palm flat against a brass plate set into the wall. There was a soft click, and the door swung open to reveal a circular space unlike anything I had ever seen. The room was lined with copper mesh that gleamed like new pennies in the light of a dozen ether lamps mounted around the perimeter. The ceiling glowed with the soft blue luminescence of refined ether, casting everything in an otherworldly radiance that made me feel as though I had stepped into a dream or perhaps a nightmare. Strange machines lined the walls, their purposes unclear, their surfaces covered with dials and switches and blinking lights that winked like distant stars. and in the center of the room stood a pedestal of black iron topped with a glass plate that pulsed with inner light. "This is the heart of my security system," Cornelius said, and there was pride in his voice, the pride of a man showing off his most precious creation. "Every door in this house, every safe, every locked cabinet is connected to this device. It reads the unique patterns of the human hand, the whorls and ridges that make each person distinct. Once your prints are registered here, you will have access to everything. You will be truly mistress of this house." I looked at the machine, at the delicate copper wires that snaked from its base into the walls, at the faint hum of power that seemed to vibrate through the floor. My father had dreamed of such things. He had filled notebook after notebook with designs for machines that could identify a person by the smallest physical markers, that could track movement through a building, that could create a record of every touch and every presence. He had believed, in his optimistic way, that such technology would make the world safer, would protect the innocent, would bring criminals to justice. He had not lived long enough to see how it could also make the world a prison. I wanted to ask Cornelius how he had built this. I wanted to ask if he had seen my father's notes, if he had stolen my father's designs, if this machine was another thing that should have belonged to my family and had instead fallen into his hands. But I kept my questions to myself. I had learned, in the years since my father's death, that questions were dangerous things. Questions revealed what you did not know, and in the world of men like Cornelius Vane, what you did not know could be used against you. Cornelius removed his gloves, pulling them off one finger at a time with the deliberate precision that characterized everything he did. His hands were pale and long-fingered, the hands of a pianist or a surgeon, and they moved with a grace that seemed at odds with his cold demeanor. He pressed his palm flat against the glass plate. The blue light brightened, pulsed 3 times, and then subsided. He gestured for me to do the same. I hesitated. There was something about the machine that made my skin prickle, some instinct that whispered of danger, some primitive warning buried deep in the part of my brain that remembered what it was to be prey. The glass plate seemed to glow more brightly as I approached, as though the machine itself was eager to learn me, to consume me, to make me part of its vast network of knowledge. But Cornelius was watching me with those pale eyes, and I knew that hesitation would be noted and remembered and perhaps held against me later. So I pulled off my own gloves, one finger at a time, and I placed my hand on the cool surface of the glass. The light rose around my fingers like water, and I felt a strange tingling sensation, not painful but deeply intimate, as if the machine were learning me, memorizing me, claiming me in some way that went beyond mere registration. I thought of how a man might learn a woman, might memorize the contours of her body, might claim her with touch and possession. But this was colder than any human touch, more thorough than any lover's exploration. This machine was reading me in ways I could not fully comprehend, mapping the whorls and ridges of my fingerprints, recording the unique patterns of my skin, storing everything in its vast mechanical memory. The pulse came, 1, 2, 3, and then the light faded and Cornelius smiled. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vane," he said. But before I could respond, the machine pulsed again. 4 times. 5. 6. The blue light turned green, then amber, then a deep and angry red. An alarm began to sound somewhere in the depths of the house, a low wailing note that seemed to come from everywhere at once, rising and falling like the cry of some wounded animal. Cornelius's smile vanished, replaced by an expression I had never seen on his face before. Fear. "What is happening?" I asked, though my voice came out barely above a whisper. He did not answer. He was staring at the glass plate, at the numbers and symbols that had begun to scroll across its surface in glowing script. I looked too, and at first I could not understand what I was seeing. The symbols were a language I did not recognize, a code that meant nothing to me. letters and numbers and strange characters that flickered past too quickly to read. And then the symbols resolved themselves into words, and the words became a name, and the name was one I had not spoken aloud in 2 years. Daniel Blackwood. Match confirmed. Residual prints detected. Location: primary fingerprint registry. Cross-reference: secondary female subject. The alarm stopped. The red light faded. And Cornelius turned to look at me with those winter eyes, and I saw in them something worse than anger. I saw calculation. I saw the cold, precise workings of a mind that was already determining how this new information might be used, how it might be leveraged, how it might be turned to his advantage. "You know this name," he said. It was not a question. I could not speak. My throat had closed around the words, around the memories, around the grief that I had thought I had buried forever. Daniel. Daniel Blackwood. The man who had come to my father's laboratory when I was 20 years old, brilliant and passionate and burning with ideas that seemed to set the very air on fire. The man who had looked at me as if I were the most remarkable thing he had ever seen. The man who had kissed me in the greenhouse on a summer afternoon, who had whispered promises against my hair, who had sworn that he would find a way for us to be together, despite the difference in our stations. The man who had disappeared on the night my father died, leaving nothing behind but ashes and accusations and a void in my heart that I had learned to carry like a stone. Daniel Blackwood had been my father's assistant. He had come to us from Manchester, a scholarship student who had studied engineering at the university there, and who had heard of my father's work through a series of academic papers that had caused quite a stir in scientific circles. He was poor, the son of a factory worker who had died young and a mother who took in washing to support her family. But he was brilliant. Within weeks of his arrival, my father was treating him not as an assistant, but as a colleague, and within months they were working together as equals. I had fallen in love with him slowly over the course of that first summer. It began with conversations in my father's workshop, discussions of ether and energy, and the nature of the universe that made my head spin with wonder. It grew through walks in the garden, through stolen glances across the dinner table, through the brush of his hand against mine as he passed me a book or a tool. And it blossomed finally in the greenhouse on an afternoon in late July, when the roses were in full bloom and the air was thick with their perfume. He had kissed me there, among the flowers, and I had kissed him back, and for one brief shining moment I had believed that everything was possible. That love could overcome class differences. That happiness was something I was allowed to have, that the future would be kind. I was wrong, of course. The future had not been kind. The future had brought fire and death and accusations that had destroyed everything I held dear. And Daniel had disappeared, vanished as if he had never existed at all, leaving me alone to face the wreckage of our lives. The official story was simple, the kind of story that newspapers love to tell, full of betrayal and violence and the dark underbelly of human nature. On the night of October 15th, 2 years ago, a fire had broken out in my father's laboratory. The building had burned to the ground in less than an hour, taking with it my father's life, his work, and his reputation. In the ashes, investigators had found evidence of sabotage, of deliberate destruction, of theft. Someone had stolen the plans for my father's greatest invention, a device that could harness and refine ether with unprecedented efficiency, and had set the fire to cover their tracks. That someone, according to the police and the newspapers and the whispers of society, was Daniel Blackwood. He had vanished that night, disappeared without a trace, and his disappearance was taken as proof of his guilt. The narrative was clean and satisfying. Daniel Blackwood, the brilliant young engineer from Manchester, had seduced his way into Frederick Ashford's trust, had stolen his life's work, and had murdered him to keep the secret. It was a story that made sense. It was a story that allowed people to nod their heads and cluck their tongues and feel that justice, though not served, was at least understood. But I had never believed it, not truly. Not in the quiet hours of the night when I lay awake and remembered the way Daniel had looked at my father, with something like reverence, like the devotion of a student to a master. Not when I recalled the conversations I had overheard, the plans they had made together, the shared excitement of men on the verge of changing the world. Daniel had loved my father. He had loved the work. And he had loved me. Or so I had believed, until he vanished and left me with nothing but questions and a grief so heavy I thought it would crush me. And now his name was glowing on a machine in my new husband's house, and I did not know what it meant, and I was more afraid than I had been in 2 long years. Cornelius was still watching me. I could feel his gaze like a physical weight, pressing against my skin, searching for the truth I was trying so desperately to hide. His eyes moved over my face the way a scientist might examine a specimen under a microscope, looking for data, for evidence, for anything that might be catalogued and analyzed and used. Daniel Blackwood was my father's assistant, I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, flat and distant, as though it belonged to someone else. He was accused of theft and murder. He disappeared. I have not seen him since. All of which was true. None of which was the whole truth. Cornelius's expression did not change, and yet his prints are in my system. His prints, which were registered alongside yours, which means that at some point he touched you. Your hands, your skin, with enough contact to leave a residual trace that my machine can still detect 2 years later. I felt the blood drain from my face. I thought of all the times Daniel had taken my hand, had pressed his palm against mine, had traced the lines of my fingers with his own. I thought of the greenhouse, of the warmth of his skin, of the way he had held my face between his hands before he kissed me. I thought of the afternoon when he had taught me to dance in my father's study, guiding me through the steps of a waltz while my father played the piano, laughing at my mistakes, pulling me close when I stumbled. The machine had read all of that. The machine had seen what I had hidden from everyone, even from myself. It was a long time ago, I said. Before the fire, before everything. Cornelius was silent for a long moment. Then he turned back to the machine and began pressing buttons, pulling up screens, scrolling through data. His movements were precise and unhurried, the movements of a man who had all the time in the world and intended to use it. Daniel Blackwood, he said softly, almost to himself. I have been looking for him for quite some time. He has something that belongs to me. Something he stole from your father before he killed him. Something I paid a great deal of money to acquire. I stared at him. What are you talking about? He glanced at me over his shoulder. Your father's ether refining process, the plans, the prototype. I had a contract with Frederick Ashford. He was going to sell me the exclusive rights to his invention. The documents were signed, the money was transferred, and then, 3 days before he was to deliver the final specifications, he died, and his laboratory burned, and Daniel Blackwood vanished with everything. My mind was spinning. I had known that my father was working on something important. I had known that there were investors, powerful men who wanted to control the ether trade. But I had not known about any contract with Cornelius Vane. I had not known that my husband and my father had been connected before the fire, before the death, before everything fell apart. My father had kept so many secrets from me, had tried so hard to protect me from the dangerous world he inhabited, and now those secrets were coming back to haunt me in ways I could never have imagined. You knew my father, I said slowly. I knew his work. I knew his value. And I knew, from the moment I saw you at Lady Ashworth's ball, that you might be the key to finding what was taken from me. The room seemed to tilt around me. I reached out and steadied myself against the wall, feeling the cold copper mesh against my palm. The metal hummed beneath my fingers, alive with the same energy that powered all of Cornelius's machines. For a moment, I felt as though I could feel the entire house pulsing around me, a vast mechanical heart beating with secrets and schemes I was only beginning to understand. You married me to find Daniel Blackwood. Cornelius smiled, and it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who had just revealed a card he had been holding close to his chest, the smile of a player who knows he has won the game. I married you for many reasons, Eleanor. Your connection to Blackwood is only one of them. But now that connection has become rather more significant than I anticipated. He gestured at the machine. This device does not merely read fingerprints. It reads etheric residue. Every person leaves a unique signature in the ether, a trace of their presence that lingers on the things they have touched. Some scientists believe that the ether itself is a kind of memory, a universal record of everything that has ever happened. My machines can read that record. Blackwood's signature is on you, faint but unmistakable, which means that somewhere in your memory there is information about him, information that will help me find him. I wanted to run. I wanted to tear off my wedding dress and flee into the fog and never look back. But there was nowhere to go. I had no money, no family, no friends who would risk their reputation to help the disgraced daughter of Frederick Ashford. I had traded everything for the safety that Cornelius Vane had offered, and now I understood that safety had been a lie from the beginning. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "I want you to remember," he said, "everything you know about Daniel Blackwood, every conversation you overheard, every place he mentioned, every plan he discussed with your father. Somewhere in those memories is the key to finding him. And you are going to help me, Eleanor. You are going to help me because you are my wife now, and because you have no other choice." He left me alone in that room with its glowing walls and its humming machines, and I stood there for a long time, staring at the glass plate where my handprint still lingered like a ghost. The blue light had faded, but I could still feel the tingle of it on my skin, the echo of its touch. I thought about Daniel. I thought about my father. I thought about the fire and the accusations and the 2 years of silence that had followed. And I thought about the notebooks hidden in the false bottom of my trunk, the notebooks that contained everything my father had known about ether refining, the notebooks that I had kept secret from everyone, even from Daniel, because my father had made me promise never to show them to anyone until he gave me permission. He had never given me permission. He had died before he could. But now I wondered if those notebooks held more than scientific formulas. I wondered if they held the truth about what had really happened on the night of October 15th. I wondered if they could prove that Daniel was innocent. And I wondered, with a cold dread that settled into my bones, what Cornelius Vane would do to me if he discovered that I had been keeping secrets of my own. The days that followed were a strange kind of purgatory, a limbo between the life I had imagined and the life I had actually received. I was installed in a suite of rooms in the east wing of the manor, beautiful rooms with silk wallpaper in a delicate shade of rose and velvet curtains the color of old wine. The furniture was French, elegant and expensive, carved wood and gilded frames and upholstery soft as clouds. The windows looked out over the formal garden, a maze of hedges and paths that seemed designed more for surveillance than for pleasure, and beyond the garden I could see the grey London sky, the rooftops of the city, the distant spire of a church. A maid was assigned to attend me, a silent girl named Mary, who seemed to appear and disappear without warning. She was young, perhaps 18 or 19, with pale hair pulled back beneath a white cap and a face that revealed nothing. Her eyes were the color of slate, flat and watchful, and they followed me everywhere I went. She helped me dress in the morning and undress at night. She brought me my meals on silver trays. She answered my questions with monosyllables and never volunteered information of her own. I did not know if she was loyal to Cornelius or simply afraid of him, but I knew that I could not trust her. I was given new clothes, gowns of silk and satin and velvet, each one more beautiful than the last. Cornelius had impeccable taste, I had to admit, and the wardrobe he provided would have been the envy of any woman in London. There were morning dresses and afternoon dresses and evening gowns, walking costumes and riding habits, and negligées trimmed with lace. There were gloves and fans and parasols, shawls and wraps and pelisses. There were hats adorned with feathers and flowers, bonnets and caps and tiaras. I could have dressed differently every day for a year and never worn the same thing twice. I was given jewelry, pearls and diamonds and sapphires that gleamed like frozen tears. I was given a household allowance that was more money than I had seen in years, more money than my family had possessed in the final desperate months before my father's death. I was given everything that a wife could want, everything except freedom. I quickly learned that Vane Manor was not merely a home. It was a fortress, a prison disguised as a palace. Every door was fitted with one of Cornelius's fingerprint readers, brass plates that glowed faintly in the gaslight and required the touch of an authorized hand to unlock. Every window was wired with sensors that would trigger an alarm if opened without permission. Every corridor was watched by the strange glowing devices that Cornelius called ether eyes, small glass spheres mounted on the walls that tracked movement and recorded everything they saw. The ether eyes were everywhere, in the hallways and the staircases and the public rooms, in the kitchens and the pantries and the servants' quarters. Even, I eventually discovered, in my own bedroom, though they were cleverly disguised as decorative fixtures. Nothing happened in that house without Cornelius knowing. No one came or went without his permission. And I, for all my fine gowns and jewels, was as much a prisoner as any woman in any tower in any fairy story. But I was not helpless. I was my father's daughter, and my father had taught me to observe, to analyze, to understand the machines that others feared. He had taught me that knowledge was power, that understanding how something worked was the first step to controlling it. And so, in the days and weeks that followed my wedding, I began to study my prison. I learned which doors required which clearances. I learned that my fingerprints gave me access to most of the public rooms, but not to Cornelius's private study, not to the basement where the main generators were housed, not to the mysterious east corridor that ended in a door that even the servants seemed to avoid. I learned which corridors were most heavily monitored and which were occasionally overlooked. I learned the rhythm of the household, the schedules of the servants, the patterns of Cornelius's own movements through the house. I learned that Cornelius left for his offices in the city every morning at 9 and returned every evening at 6, except on Thursdays, when he attended meetings of the Royal Scientific Society and did not return until nearly midnight. I learned that the cook prepared his meals according to a strict schedule and that he ate alone in his study unless we had guests. I learned that he spent his evenings in his private laboratory working on projects he would not discuss with me, and that the sounds that emerged from behind those locked doors were sometimes strange and troubling. And I learned, slowly and carefully, how to retrieve my father's notebooks from their hiding place without triggering any of the sensors that might alert my husband to what I was doing. It took me 3 weeks to find a safe time. 3 weeks of watching and waiting and pretending to be the docile wife Cornelius expected. 3 weeks of smiling at his cold comments and enduring his occasional inspections of my activities and playing the part of a woman who had accepted her fate. It was exhausting, this constant performance, this endless game of deception. But I was good at it. I had been performing all my life, playing the role of the proper young lady, the dutiful daughter, the respectable woman. This was just another mask, and I wore it well. The opportunity came on a Thursday evening when Cornelius was away at his meeting and the house was quiet. Mary had been sent to the village on an errand that would keep her away until the following morning. The other servants were occupied with their duties in distant parts of the house, invisible and silent as always. The manor was as quiet and as empty as it ever became. I went to my trunk, the battered leather trunk that had traveled with me from house to house as my family's fortunes declined. It was the only thing I had left from my old life, the only object that Cornelius had not replaced with something newer and more expensive. He had offered to dispose of it, to replace it with a set of matching luggage in the latest style, but I had refused. I had told him it had sentimental value, and he had shrugged and allowed me to keep it, clearly believing that my attachment to such a shabby object was proof of my inferior breeding. I ran my fingers over the worn leather, remembering how my mother had packed it for me on the day I left for boarding school, how my father had carried it down the stairs on the day I came home again. So many memories lived in that trunk. So many ghosts. I knelt on the floor and pressed the hidden catch that my father had installed himself, a small mechanism disguised as a decorative brass fitting. There was a soft click, and the false bottom swung open, and there they were. 3 notebooks bound in brown leather, filled with my father's cramped handwriting and detailed diagrams. I had not opened them since the fire. I had not been able to bear it. The sight of my father's handwriting, the familiar loops and crosses of his script, would have been too much. It would have broken me in ways I could not afford to be broken. And so I had kept them hidden, had carried them with me from lodging house to lodging house, had protected them without ever looking at them, like a sacred relic too precious to touch. But now I lifted the first one with trembling hands and began to read. The entries started 2 years before my father's death, when he had first begun to experiment with ether refinement. The early pages were full of excitement and optimism, the words of a man who believed he was on the verge of a great discovery. Ether is everywhere, he had written. It fills the space between atoms, the gaps between stars, the void that we call emptiness. If I can learn to capture it, to refine it, to harness its power, I can change the world. I skimmed through pages of equations and technical specifications, diagrams of machines I did not fully understand, notes on experiments that had succeeded or failed. My father's voice spoke to me from these pages, patient and methodical, explaining his reasoning, documenting his process, building towards something that would change the world. And then, about halfway through the second notebook, I found it. A letter, folded and tucked between the pages. A letter in my father's handwriting, addressed to me. My dearest Eleanor, it began, and my heart clenched at the familiar salutation, the way he had always begun his letters to me, even when I was a child at school and he wrote every week without fail. If you are reading this, then I am dead, and I did not have the chance to tell you the truth. I am sorry. I am so sorry. There is so much I should have said, so much I should have explained, but I was trying to protect you. I see now that my silence may have put you in greater danger than my honesty ever could. Daniel is not what he seems, but he is not what they will say about him either. He is caught, as I am caught, in something larger and more dangerous than either of us fully understood. There is a man, a powerful man, who has been watching my work for years. He wants to control the ether trade. He wants to control everything, and he will stop at nothing to get what he wants. If something happens to me, do not trust the official story. Do not trust the police. And above all, do not trust Cornelius Vane. Find Daniel. He has the proof of everything. He has the truth. I love you, my darling girl. I am sorry I could not protect you better. Your father. The letter fell from my hands. I sat on the floor of my beautiful prison, surrounded by silk and velvet and the soft hum of etheric machines, and I felt the world I thought I knew crumble around me like ash. Cornelius Vane, my husband, my jailer, the man who had offered me safety and respectability and a name that would open doors. The man who had been watching my father for years, the man who, according to my father's own words, would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. What had he done? What had he done to my father? What was he planning to do to me? And where, in all of London, in all of England, in all the world, was Daniel Blackwood? I hid the notebooks again, taking care to leave everything exactly as I had found it. Then I went to the window and stood looking out at the garden, at the gray November sky, at the fog that crept across the lawn like a living thing. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, pale and strange, a woman I barely recognized. I had aged in the past 2 years, had lost weight and color and something else that was harder to define. The brightness that had once lived in my eyes had dimmed to a faint flicker, and the mouth that had once smiled easily now seemed to have forgotten how. I had married a monster. That much was clear. But I was beginning to realize that I was not the helpless victim I had believed myself to be. I had information. I had my father's notes. I had 2 years of silence and invisibility that had taught me how to survive in a world that wanted me to disappear. And I had something else. Something I had discovered in the registry room on my wedding night. Something Cornelius had overlooked in his focus on Daniel's prints. The machine had detected Daniel's residue on me. But it had also, for a brief moment before Cornelius overrode the display, shown me something else. A location. A set of coordinates. The last place where Daniel's etheric signature had been registered in the Vane system. He was in London. He had been here, in this very house, less than 6 months ago. Daniel was alive, and he was close. I just had to find him before Cornelius found him first. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. 3 days after I discovered my father's letter, Cornelius announced that we would be attending a reception at the Royal Society, a gathering of scientists and investors and politicians who all wanted a piece of the ether revolution. He wanted to show off his new wife, he said. He wanted to demonstrate that the scandal of my father's death had not tarnished his own reputation. He wanted, in his cold and calculating way, to establish that he had won. I wore a gown of deep blue silk, the color of refined ether, with a bodice that hugged my waist and a skirt that swept the floor like a whisper. The fabric was the finest I had ever worn, softer than water, and it caught the light in ways that made it seem almost alive. Sapphires gleamed at my throat and in my ears, stones that Cornelius had given me as a wedding gift, stones that felt like chains even as they sparkled. Mary arranged my hair in elaborate curls, threading pearls through the dark waves, and painted my lips with rouge the color of crushed roses. When she was finished, she stepped back and surveyed her work with those flat, unreadable eyes. "You look beautiful, madam," she said in her soft voice. I did not feel beautiful. I felt like a doll being dressed for display, a marionette whose strings were held by hands I could not see. But I smiled and thanked her and took my husband's arm, and I climbed into the carriage that would take us through the foggy streets of London to the Royal Society's hall. The journey was silent. Cornelius sat across from me in the carriage, his pale eyes fixed on some point beyond my shoulder, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. The streets of London passed by outside the windows, gaslit and shadowy, full of figures that moved through the fog like ghosts. I watched them without seeing them, my mind racing with plans and fears and desperate hopes. The reception was everything I had expected and more. The Royal Society's hall was magnificent, a vast space with soaring ceilings and walls lined with portraits of famous scientists stretching back centuries. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted arches, their light multiplied by mirrors that lined the walls. Champagne flowed like water, poured by servants who moved through the crowd like shadows. Men in evening dress and women in gowns that cost more than most families earned in a year gathered in clusters, their voices rising and falling in waves of conversation that meant nothing and everything at once. The air was thick with perfume and cigar smoke and the electric crackle of ambition. Everyone wanted something. Everyone was watching everyone else, calculating odds, measuring worth, looking for weakness. I moved through the crowd like a ghost myself, smiling and nodding and making the appropriate small talk whenever someone deigned to notice me. I was introduced to investors and industrialists, men with whiskers and watch chains who looked at me with varying degrees of interest and disdain. I was introduced to politicians and peers, lords and ladies who murmured polite nothings and moved on to more important conversations. I was introduced to scientists who spoke of ether and energy in terms I understood better than they realized, and to their wives who spoke of fashion and servants and the difficulty of finding good help. I said all the right things. I laughed at all the right moments. I played the part of the devoted wife with a skill that surprised even me. But all the while, my eyes were scanning the room, searching for something I was not sure I would recognize if I found it. And then I saw him. He was standing in the doorway of a side corridor, half hidden by a potted palm, his dark clothes blending into the shadows. He was thinner than I remembered, and there were shadows under his eyes that had not been there 2 years ago. His dark hair was longer, curling at his collar in a way that would have been unfashionable if anyone had been looking at him closely. But no one was looking at him. He had made himself invisible, had adopted the stance and expression of someone who belonged in the background, someone who was not worth noticing. But I would have known him anywhere. I would have known him in a crowd of thousands, in a room full of strangers, in the darkest night or the brightest day. I would have known the set of his shoulders, the angle of his jaw, the way he held himself when he was trying not to be seen. Daniel. Our eyes met across the room. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs, could feel the blood rushing in my ears, could feel every nerve in my body come alive in a way they had not since the night he disappeared. 2 years. 2 years of grief and silence and a void that had swallowed everything I thought I knew about love. And here he was, alive and real and close enough to touch. He shook his head, just slightly. A warning. Do not approach. Do not acknowledge me. And then he turned and vanished into the corridor. I should have stayed where I was. I should have been sensible and careful and remembered that my husband's eyes were everywhere, watching everything. But I was not sensible. I was not careful. I was a woman who had just seen a ghost, and I needed to know if he was real. I set down my glass of champagne and followed him. The corridor was dimly lit, lined with portraits of famous scientists and shelves of leather-bound books. My footsteps were muffled by the thick carpet, but I walked quickly, my heart in my throat, my eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. At the end of the corridor was a door, slightly ajar, a thin line of light visible through the gap. I pushed it open and stepped through. It was a small study, dark except for the light of a single gas lamp. Daniel was standing by the window, his back to me, his hands gripping the sill as if he might collapse without its support. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid line of his spine, and I knew that whatever composure he had maintained in the ballroom had been stripped away the moment he was alone. "You should not have followed me," he said, without turning around. His voice was hoarse, rougher than I remembered, as though something had damaged it. "It is not safe." I closed the door behind me. The sound of it clicking shut was loud in the silence. Safe. I have not been safe since the night you left me. He turned then, and I saw his face clearly for the first time in 2 years. He looked older, harder. There were lines around his eyes and a scar on his jaw that had not been there before, a thin white line that spoke of violence and pain. But his eyes were the same, dark and deep, and filled with an emotion that matched my own. I saw grief in those eyes, and guilt, and a love so fierce it took my breath away. Eleanor. He said my name like a prayer, like an apology, like a promise he had broken and could never repair. I did not leave you. I was taken. I stared at him. Taken? By whom? By Cornelius Vane. His voice was bitter, edged with a hatred that I had never heard from him before. Your husband. My captor. The man who killed your father. The words hit me like a blow. I had suspected it, had feared it ever since I read my father's letter. But hearing Daniel say it aloud made it real in a way that I had not been prepared for. My knees felt weak. The room seemed to spin around me. I reached out and steadied myself against the doorframe. He held me for nearly a year, Daniel continued, in a facility outside London, a place where he conducts his experiments, where he tests his machines, where he keeps the people who have information he wants. He wanted the plans, the formulas, everything your father had created. When I would not give them to him, he stopped, and I saw a shadow cross his face, a memory too painful to speak aloud. He tried to break me, Eleanor, in every way you can imagine, and some you cannot. I took a step toward him. My hand was reaching out before I could stop it, reaching for him the way it always had, drawn to him by a force I could not name or resist. But how did you escape? I had help. There are others who oppose Vane, who have seen what he truly is, a network of scientists and reformers and people who believe that progress should not come at the cost of human lives. They got me out 6 months ago. I have been hiding ever since, gathering evidence, trying to find a way to bring him down without getting you hurt. Me? He looked at me, and there was agony in his eyes. I knew he would come for you eventually. I knew he would use you to get to me. That is why I stayed away. That is why I let you believe I was a murderer. Why I let you believe I had abandoned you. Because as long as you hated me, as long as you wanted nothing to do with me, you were safe from him. But I never hated you. The words came out in a rush, carried on a wave of emotion I had kept dammed up for 2 years. I never believed it, Daniel. Not truly. I loved you. I loved you. And when you disappeared, I could not finish the sentence. The tears I had refused to shed for 2 years were finally breaking free, streaming down my face, destroying Mary's careful work with the rouge. Daniel crossed the distance between us in 2 strides and pulled me into his arms. I know, he whispered against my hair. I know. I am sorry. I am so sorry. For a long moment, I let myself sink into him. I let myself remember what it had felt like to be held by someone who truly loved me, who saw me as I was and not as a pawn in some larger game. His arms were strong around me, his heart beating steady against my cheek, and I thought that I would happily stay here forever, hidden in this dark little room while the glittering world outside continued without us. But we did not have forever. We had only minutes, perhaps seconds, before someone noticed my absence and came looking. "Daniel," I said, pulling back just far enough to look at his face. My father left me his notebooks. He hid a letter inside. He said, "You have proof. Proof of what Vane has done." Daniel nodded. "I have the original contracts, showing that Vane paid your father for the ether technology months before the fire. And I have evidence that the fire was deliberately set by Vane's men. Witnesses, documents, enough to destroy him if I can get it to the right people. Then we have to move quickly. I have access to his house now. I am his wife. His machines have registered my prints. If there is anything inside that mansion that could help prove his guilt, I can find it." "No." Daniel's grip tightened on my arms. "It is too dangerous. If he suspects you know anything, he already suspects. He married me because he thought I could lead him to you. He knows about the residual prints. He knows we were." He paused, swallowed hard. "He knows we were close." I looked into his eyes, those dark, familiar eyes that had haunted my dreams for 2 years. "Then we have nothing to lose. Let me help you, Daniel. Let me finish what my father started." He was silent for a long moment. I could see the struggle on his face, the war between his desire to protect me and his knowledge that I was right. We needed each other. We needed to work together if we were going to bring Cornelius Vane to justice. Finally, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a brass cylinder about the size of my finger. He pressed it into my palm. "This is a signal device," he said. "If you find anything, if you are in danger, press the button at the top. It will send a pulse through the ether that I will be able to detect from anywhere in London. I will come for you, Eleanor. No matter what, I will come." I curled my fingers around the cylinder, feeling its weight, its promise. I wanted to say so many things. I wanted to tell him that I had never stopped loving him, that every day of the past 2 years had been a kind of death, that I would rather face any danger with him than any safety without him. But there was no time for any of that. "Go," I said, "before someone comes." He kissed me then. Quick and fierce, a kiss that tasted of desperation and longing and the bitter salt of tears. And then he was gone, slipping through a hidden door I had not noticed, disappearing into the night like the ghost everyone believed him to be. I stood alone in the dark room for a long moment, pressing my fingers to my lips, trying to hold on to the feel of him. Then I wiped my eyes, straightened my gown, and went back out into the glittering world to play the part of the devoted wife. But I was not a devoted wife. I was a woman with a mission, and I would not rest until Cornelius Vane had paid for everything he had done. The weeks that followed were the most dangerous and exhilarating of my life. By day, I played the role of Mrs. Vane with perfect precision, hosting tea parties and attending dinners and smiling at all the right moments. I learned to navigate the social world of London's elite, to make small talk about fashion and weather and the latest scandals, to pretend that I cared about things that meant nothing to me. I learned to endure Cornelius's presence at meals, his cold conversation, his occasional attempts to extract information about my past. I learned to smile when he touched my hand, to nod when he spoke, to be everything he expected his wife to be. By night, I explored my prison, learning its secrets, cataloging its weaknesses, searching for the evidence that would bring my husband down. It was not easy. Cornelius's security was formidable, and his paranoia was well-founded. Every document was locked in safes with triple layers of protection. Every room was monitored by ether eyes. Every servant was loyal to him first, and to me not at all. I moved through the house like a woman walking on thin ice, knowing that one wrong step could plunge me into waters from which I would never emerge. But I was patient, and I was careful, and I was my father's daughter, which meant that I understood Cornelius's machines better than he suspected. The breakthrough came in the 7th week of my marriage. I had been systematically testing the ether eye network, looking for gaps in coverage, and I had discovered something interesting. The eyes were powered by a central generator in the basement, and twice a day, at precisely 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening, the generator cycled through a maintenance routine that left certain corridors unwatched for exactly 90 seconds. 90 seconds was not much time, but it was enough. On a gray December evening, I made my move. Cornelius was in his study, attending to correspondence that had arrived from his factories in the north. The servants were occupied with dinner preparations, moving through the kitchens and pantries in the choreographed dance of their daily routine. I had exactly 90 seconds to reach the door at the end of the east corridor, a door that led to a room Cornelius had forbidden me to enter, a room whose very existence he had never acknowledged. I waited by the window of my sitting room, watching the clock on the mantel, counting the seconds in my head. The fog outside was thick tonight, pressing against the glass like a living thing, muffling the sounds of the city. When the minute hand reached 6, I moved. The corridor was dark. I had memorized every step, every floorboard that might creak, every obstacle that might slow me down. I ran on silent feet, my heart pounding, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. 40 seconds, 50, 60. The door was ahead of me, a plain wooden door with no handle, only a fingerprint plate glowing faintly in the darkness. I pressed my palm against it and prayed. The lock clicked. The door swung open. I slipped through and pulled it shut behind me just as the ether eyes flickered back to life. For a moment, I stood in absolute darkness, listening to the blood roar in my ears. Then I fumbled in my pocket for the small electric torch I had stolen from the servants' quarters, and I turned it on. The room was full of machines. Massive copper cylinders lined the walls, connected by webs of wire and tubing that pulsed with blue light. In the center of the room stood a device I recognized from my father's notebooks: the ether refiner, the invention that had been the cause of so much death and destruction. But this was not my father's design. This was something larger, more complex, more sinister. Where my father's sketches had shown a machine elegant in its simplicity, This was a monster of brass and glass and glowing tubes, humming with power that seemed almost alive. And on a table beside the refiner, stacked in neat piles, were documents, contracts, letters, records. I had found what I was looking for. I did not have time to read everything. I grabbed as much as I could carry, stuffing papers into the hidden pockets I had sewn into my petticoat, memorizing the layout of the room so I could describe it to Daniel later. My hands were shaking. My heart was racing. Every second felt like an eternity, and every sound from beyond the door made me freeze in terror. And then, in the back corner of the room, I saw something that stopped me cold. A cabinet, glass-fronted, like something you might find in a museum or a natural history collection. And inside the cabinet, arranged on velvet-lined shelves, were photographs. Photographs of my father, photographs of Daniel, photographs of the laboratory before the fire, and photographs of the ashes afterward. Photographs of me, taken without my knowledge, at the market and the church and the charity ball where I had first met Cornelius. There were dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, documenting my life over what must have been years. He had been watching us, all of us, for years. And in the center of the cabinet, in a place of honor, was a single item that made my blood turn to ice. My father's pocket watch, the watch that had been on his body when he died, the watch that should have been destroyed in the fire, melted to slag along with everything else. But here it was, whole, perfect, gleaming under the blue light of the ether machines. Cornelius had taken it. He had taken it from my father's body, or perhaps from the ruins of the laboratory, and he had kept it here like a trophy, like a prize, like proof of what he had done. I reached into the cabinet and took the watch. It was cool against my palm, cool and heavy, and when I pressed the clasp, it opened to reveal the face, and, behind the face, a tiny compartment I had forgotten existed. A compartment where my father used to keep small notes, secrets, messages he did not want anyone else to see. There was a note inside, a single slip of paper, yellowed with age, covered in my father's cramped handwriting. CV has threatened my life. If I do not give him the plans, he will kill me and take Eleanor. I have hidden the final formula where only she can find it. My daughter, my brilliant girl, she will understand. The numbers that followed were not coordinates. They were not chemical formulas. They were a code, one that my father and I had invented together when I was a child, a private language that no one else in the world could decipher. I stared at the note, my mind racing. The final formula, the piece that Cornelius had been searching for, the piece that Daniel had never had, the piece that my father had hidden so well that 2 years of searching had never uncovered it. My father had left it for me, only for me. And now, at last, I knew where to find it. I slipped the watch into my pocket and ran. 90 seconds had long since passed, but I no longer cared about the ether eyes. I no longer cared about being careful or patient or sensible. I had the evidence I needed. I had the key to my father's last secret. And I had to get out of this house before Cornelius discovered what I had done. I made it to the main hall before the alarm started. The sound was deafening, a shrieking wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Red light flooded the corridors, doors slammed shut, locks engaging with heavy clicks that echoed through the house like gunshots. And from somewhere in the depths of the manor, I heard Cornelius's voice, cold and furious, shouting orders. Find her, and bring her to me. I ran through corridors I had memorized, past servants who stared at me with wide eyes, through rooms where ether eyes swiveled to track my movement. I ran until I reached the window I had identified weeks ago, the window whose lock I had sabotaged with a hairpin, the window that opened onto the garden and the fog beyond. I threw open the sash and climbed through. The night air hit me like a slap, cold and damp, tasting of smoke and winter. I dropped to the ground, stumbled, found my footing, and then I ran again, across the lawn, through the gate, into the streets of London. I did not know where I was going. I did not have a plan. All I knew was that I had to get away, had to find Daniel, had to reach safety before Cornelius's men caught up with me. I pulled the brass cylinder from my pocket and pressed the button at the top. A faint vibration ran through my fingers, a pulse of energy that shot out into the night. And then I kept running. The fog swallowed me. The city swallowed me. I ran until I could not run anymore, until my lungs were burning and my legs were shaking and my beautiful blue silk gown was torn and muddy beyond repair. I found myself in a narrow alley, pressed against a cold brick wall, gasping for breath and praying that Daniel had received my signal. Minutes passed. Hours, perhaps. I lost track of time in that gray limbo between fear and hope. The fog was so thick I could barely see my own hands. The sounds of the city were muffled and strange, distant carriage wheels and the occasional cry of a night watchman. I pressed myself deeper into the shadows and tried to slow my racing heart. And then I heard footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate, and I pressed myself against the wall, hardly daring to breathe. A figure emerged from the fog, tall, familiar, alive. Eleanor. Daniel's voice was thick with relief. Thank God, thank God. He caught me as I fell forward, as my legs finally gave way beneath me. He held me against his chest, his arms wrapped around me like a shield, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. I found it. I whispered at last. I found everything. The contracts, the letters, the proof that he killed my father. And I found something else. My father's last message, the final formula. He hid it, Daniel. He hid it where only I could find it. Daniel pulled back just far enough to look at my face. Where? I told him. I told him about the code, about the location my father had specified, about the place where the last piece of the puzzle had been waiting for 2 years. And as I spoke, I saw the understanding dawn in his eyes. The greenhouse, he said softly. Of course, the greenhouse where we first kissed. Yes. My father must have known. He must have seen us together, must have understood what was between us, even if we never spoke of it. And he hid his greatest secret in the place where he knew I would eventually go, looking for my own. Daniel was silent for a moment. Then he smiled, a real smile, the first I had seen from him since that long-ago summer. Your father was a brilliant man. He was. Tears were streaming down my face again, but this time they were not tears of grief. They were tears of something that felt dangerously close to joy, and he would have wanted us to finish what he started, together. Daniel took my hand. Then that is what we will do. The greenhouse was still standing. I do not know why I was surprised. The fire had destroyed the laboratory, the main house, everything that my family had owned. But the greenhouse was at the far end of the property, separated from the rest by a stone wall and a stretch of overgrown garden. It had been abandoned, neglected, left to the mercy of time and weather. But it was still there. We went under cover of darkness, 2 nights after my escape from Vane Manor. Daniel had arranged safe passage with his allies, a network of engineers and scientists and reformers who shared his commitment to bringing Cornelius Vane to justice. They had given us disguises, resources, a plan. But the retrieval of my father's secret was something we had to do alone. The greenhouse was cold and dark, filled with the ghosts of plants that had long since died. Broken glass littered the floor, crunching beneath our feet as we walked. Vines crept through the shattered roof, reaching toward a sky they could no longer see. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, remembering how it had looked 2 years ago, full of light and life and the heady perfume of roses. This was where Daniel had kissed me for the first time. This was where I had allowed myself to hope for a future that scandal and murder had stolen away. And this was where my father had hidden the key to everything. The code led us to a loose brick in the wall behind the potting bench. Daniel pried it free, and there, in the hollow space behind it, was a small metal box. I lifted it out with trembling hands and opened the lid. Inside was a sheaf of papers covered in my father's handwriting, the final formula, the missing piece of the ether refining process, the invention that Cornelius Vane had been willing to kill for. But there was something else. A letter, sealed with my father's ring, addressed to me. I read it aloud, my voice breaking on every other word. My dearest Eleanor, if you have found this, then you have proven yourself to be everything I always believed you were. Brave, clever, resourceful. My greatest invention was never the ether refiner. It was you. I am sorry for the danger I have put you in. I am sorry for the secrets I kept. I thought I was protecting you, but I see now that I should have trusted you with the truth from the beginning. Daniel Blackwood is a good man. I know you love him. I know he loves you. And I know that together you can do what I could not. You can stop Cornelius Vane. You can expose his crimes. You can change the world. Use the formula wisely. It is more powerful than you know. And remember always that true progress is not measured in machines or money. It is measured in the lives we save, the justice we serve, the love we give and receive. I am proud of you, my darling girl. I will always be proud of you, your loving father. I could not speak. I could not breathe. Daniel put his arms around me and held me as I wept, as 2 years of grief and fear and loneliness finally found their release. We stood there in the ruins of my past, surrounded by dead flowers and broken glass, and I felt something inside me begin to heal. And when the tears subsided, we took my father's papers and walked out of the greenhouse into the cold December night. We had work to do. The days that followed our reunion in the greenhouse were a whirlwind of preparation and planning. Daniel had established himself in a modest boarding house in Whitechapel, a neighborhood where no one asked questions and where Cornelius's influence did not reach. I went there directly from the greenhouse, still wearing my torn and muddy gown, still clutching my father's papers against my chest. The room was small and sparse, a far cry from the opulent chambers of Vane Manor, but it felt more like home than any place I had been in 2 years. There was a narrow bed covered with a threadbare quilt, a wooden table scarred by years of use, a window that looked out onto a courtyard where children played and women hung laundry on lines strung between the buildings. It smelled of coal smoke and cooking and the particular mustiness of old buildings, and I loved it immediately. Daniel's allies came and went at all hours, bringing news and supplies and intelligence about Cornelius's movements. There was Margaret Chen, a chemist who had once worked in one of Vane's factories and who had seen firsthand the conditions he imposed on his workers. There was Thomas Hartley, a journalist who had been investigating Vane for years and who had been waiting for evidence strong enough to publish. There was Dr. Sarah Ashworth, no relation to the lady who had hosted the ball where I met Cornelius, a physician who ran a free clinic in the East End and who had treated many of the workers injured in Vane's facilities. They were ordinary people, all of them, with ordinary lives and ordinary concerns. But they had seen the darkness at the heart of Cornelius Vane's empire, and they had decided to fight it. They welcomed me into their circle with a warmth that brought tears to my eyes. We spent long hours poring over the documents I had stolen, piecing together the evidence of Cornelius's crimes. The contracts showed that he had paid my father a substantial sum for exclusive rights to the ether refining technology, money that had never reached my father's accounts. The letters revealed a pattern of threats and intimidation, escalating demands that made it clear Cornelius would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. And the photographs from the trophy cabinet told a story of obsession and surveillance that chilled me to the bone. But the most damning evidence came from the witnesses Daniel had gathered during his months in hiding. Workers who had seen the men Cornelius sent to set the fire. Guards who had been present during Daniel's imprisonment and who had witnessed the torture he endured. Servants from Vane Manor itself. People who had grown weary of living in fear and who were willing to testify in exchange for protection. It took us 3 weeks to compile everything into a case that would stand up in court. 3 weeks of sleepless nights and anxious days, of meetings with lawyers and magistrates and members of Parliament who had their own reasons for wanting to see Cornelius fall. 3 weeks of waiting for the hammer to drop, knowing that Cornelius was searching for me, knowing that his reach was long and his patience short. During those weeks, Daniel and I rediscovered each other. We talked for hours about everything we had lost and everything we hoped to gain. We mourned my father together, sharing memories and tears and the particular grief that comes from losing someone before you had the chance to say goodbye. We planned for a future that had once seemed impossible, a future where we could be together without fear, where we could build something good from the ashes of so much destruction. And we fell in love again, or perhaps we simply acknowledged the love that had never truly gone away. It was different now than it had been in the greenhouse 2 years ago. Deeper, more urgent, tempered by suffering and strengthened by survival. We were not the same people we had been then, and the love we shared was not the same love. It was better. It was real. The arrest came on a Tuesday morning in January, just as the first snow of winter began to fall. Cornelius was taken from his offices in the city, surrounded by police and journalists and crowds of curious onlookers who had heard rumors of what was to come. I was not there to see it. I was in the boarding house in Whitechapel, watching the snow drift past the window and thinking about my father and wondering if he would have been proud of what we had accomplished. But I heard about it later, from Thomas Hartley and from the newspapers that covered every detail of the scandal. I heard how Cornelius had fought against the officers who came to arrest him, how he had shouted threats and accusations, how he had promised to destroy everyone who had conspired against him. I heard how his employees had scattered like rats from a sinking ship, how his investors had rushed to distance themselves from the scandal, how his carefully constructed empire had begun to crumble the moment the first charges were announced. And I heard how he had spoken my name, just once, as they led him away in chains. Eleanor, he had said, and there was something in his voice that the witnesses could not quite describe, something that might have been admiration or hatred or both. The trial of Cornelius Vane was the scandal of the decade. It dominated the newspapers for weeks, crowding out all other news, becoming the only topic of conversation in drawing rooms and coffee houses across London. The evidence was overwhelming, letters and contracts and witness testimony that painted a picture of a man consumed by greed and utterly devoid of conscience. He had murdered my father. He had framed Daniel. He had built his empire on theft and lies and the bodies of everyone who stood in his way. I testified against him. I stood in the witness box, wearing a plain black dress and my father's pocket watch around my neck, and I told the world what Cornelius Vane had done. I told them about the wedding scanner and the residual prints. I told them about the hidden room and the trophy cabinet. I told them about my father's letter and the final formula and the greenhouse where I had found both my father's last gift and my own lost love. The courtroom was packed every day of the trial. Society matrons and factory workers, politicians and prostitutes all crowded together to witness the downfall of one of the most powerful men in England. They came to see justice done, or to see a scandal unfold, or simply to say that they had been there when it happened. I did not care why they came. I only cared that they heard the truth. Cornelius was convicted on all counts: murder, theft, fraud, conspiracy. The judge pronounced the sentence with a grim satisfaction, and I watched as my husband, the man I had married for safety, was led away in chains. His face was blank as they took him, empty of all expression, as though he had already retreated to some place deep inside himself where the verdicts of human courts could not reach him. He was sentenced to hang, though the sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment after several prominent politicians intervened on his behalf. I did not care. He would spend the rest of his days in a cell, surrounded by stone walls instead of ether machines, and that was enough. His empire was destroyed. His reputation was ruined, and his machines, those terrible, beautiful machines that had been used to control and surveil and imprison, were dismantled and repurposed for more noble ends. Daniel and I were married in the spring, when the roses were beginning to bloom and the world seemed full of new beginnings. It was a quiet ceremony, held in a small church in the countryside, attended only by our closest friends and the allies who had helped us bring Cornelius to justice. I wore a gown of cream-colored silk, simpler than the one I had worn for my first wedding, but infinitely more precious, because this time I had chosen it myself. Daniel wore a suit that fit him perfectly, and his eyes were bright with joy as he took my hand and spoke the vows that would bind us together. We cried during the ceremony, both of us, because we could not quite believe that we had survived to speak those words. We had walked through fire, literally and figuratively, and we had emerged on the other side, scarred but unbroken, changed but still ourselves. We took over my father's work. Not the ether refining, we released those plans to the public so that no single person could ever again control the technology. We gave it freely to anyone who wanted it, believing that knowledge should belong to everyone, that progress should not be hoarded by the wealthy and powerful. But his other work, his real work, the machines that could identify and track and protect, we built those differently. We built them with safeguards and limitations and public oversight. We built them as tools for justice, not instruments of tyranny. It was not easy. Nothing worth doing ever is. There were setbacks and failures and long nights when we wondered if we were making any difference at all. There were enemies who resented what we had done, friends of Cornelius who blamed us for his fall, industrialists who saw our reforms as threats to their profits. We received threats. We faced opposition. We learned that changing the world is a slow and painful process that rarely moves in straight lines. But we kept working. We kept trying. We kept believing that the world could be better than it was, that progress and humanity could coexist, that love and justice were not mutually exclusive. And sometimes on quiet evenings when the work was done and the house was still, we would sit together in the greenhouse we had rebuilt on the grounds of our modest home. We would look at the roses we had planted, the flowers that Cornelius had called inefficient, and we would remember how it had all begun. A kiss stolen in the summer sunlight, a fire that destroyed everything, a machine that revealed a ghost. I never forgot my father. I never forgot the price he paid for his ideals, or the sacrifice he made to protect me. But I stopped grieving for him in the way I had grieved before. I stopped carrying his death like a stone around my neck, because I understood at last what he had wanted me to understand all along. The past is not a prison. It is a foundation. It is the ground on which we build our futures, the fuel that feeds our fire. We can honor those we have lost, not by clinging to their memory, but by living the lives they wanted for us, lives of courage and integrity and love. I married a monster, and I discovered that I was stronger than I knew. I loved a man who disappeared, and I learned that love can survive even the darkest night. I lost everything, my family, my fortune, my faith in the world, and I found it all again in the most unexpected places. My name is Eleanor Blackwood now. I was once the daughter of a disgraced inventor, the wife of a murderer, the ghost of a woman who had given up on ever being happy again. But I am none of those things anymore. I am a scientist, a reformer, a wife, and, as I write these words, a mother. My daughter sleeps in the nursery upstairs, her tiny hands curled into fists, her breath soft and even. She has her father's dark eyes and my father's stubborn chin, and I have already begun to teach her the code that my father taught me, the secret language that saved my life and brought me back to love. I am a woman who has walked through fire and emerged on the other side, forever changed, but entirely myself. And if there is one thing I have learned from all of it, one truth that I would carve into stone if I could, it is this: the machines we build can never be more powerful than the hearts that control them. Technology is not good or evil. Progress is not salvation or damnation. It is all a matter of choice, of who we are, of what we are willing to sacrifice, and what we are willing to protect. My father understood that. Daniel understands it. And now, at last, so do I. The fog has lifted, the sun is shining, and somewhere in the distance I can hear the sound of carriage wheels on cobblestone, carrying the future toward us like a promise. I am ready to meet it.